In the deep black of space where stars seemed like scattered sparks on a great dark cloth, the ship drifted in silence, carrying with it the hopes of an entire species. Humanity had long dreamed of reaching the stars, and when the first contact came, decades ago, it had been through messages sent across the void, messages that were eventually understood with the help of a universal translation network. That every civilized world now depended on this device was not a large machine in a cold laboratory. It was a small, smooth oval worn behind the ear, warm to the touch, humming faintly and able to turn the most alien sound into perfect words for the listener, and it was considered flawless, without error, without failure. Lena sat in the passenger cabin, looking at her reflection in the darkened window, the stars sliding past behind her. She was young for a diplomat, but her record in smaller missions had drawn the attention of the council. She had the kind of calm presence that made people stop shouting and listen, the kind of tone that made enemies hesitate before acting. The mission now was unlike any she had faced before. Two alien factions, both strong, both ancient, and both suspicious of each other, had been locked in bitter conflict. For generations, the alliance had convinced them to sit at the same table for talks, but their patience was thin. The smallest insult could spark war, not just between them, but in a way that would pull in many worlds, including Earth. The ship's soft lights pulsed as a voice came over the intercom announcing their approach. Lena stood smoothing the crease in her plain but formal uniform. She touched the translator at her ear out of habit, feeling the gentle vibration it gave every few seconds. The council tech teams had checked it that morning. It was fully functional, yet as she sat there waiting for the docking clamps to engage, she thought she saw the faintest flicker of its status light. She told herself it was nothing, perhaps the reflection from the cabin lights. The station came into view, a massive construct of metal and crystal, rotating slowly above a blue and green planet. Its size was such that even the great human orbital cities looked like toys beside it. Docking arms extended toward them like the fingers of some mechanical giant. As they locked into place, Lena rose and took a deep breath. She was not only representing humanity, she was carrying the responsibility of showing that humans could handle the most dangerous and delicate of talks without losing control. She walked down the long connecting corridor with its curved walls and patterned floor panels that shifted color as she stepped on them. The air was slightly heavier than on Earth, carrying the faint scent of minerals. The station was neutral territory, but its builders had left small signs of their own culture in every detail. The light had a subtle golden tint. The sounds carried a soft echo, as if the walls themselves were listening. At the end of the corridor, the great council chamber waited. Two tall doors opened slowly, revealing a space vast enough to hold hundreds. The ceiling arched high with beams of glowing crystal light cascading down onto a long curved table around which the delegates from both alien factions already sat. Their forms were varied, yet each carried themselves with the same stiffness of pride and suspicion. The humans had studied their languages, gestures, and customs for years, and Lena had trained endlessly to avoid even the smallest mistake. She could feel the weight of their eyes following her every step. Presiding moderator, an older alien from a neutral race, stood and welcomed her. With a formal phrase the translator whispered in her ear, and she responded carefully, each syllable shaped to be neutral and respectful. As she took her seat between the two factions, she noticed the flicker again. This time it was sharper. The translator's light blinked out for a heartbeat, then returned. She forced herself to ignore it. The device had never failed in decades of use. It could not fail now. The discussion began with ritual statements, each side speaking in turn. The words were translated smoothly, and Lena responded where needed, offering clarifications, framing points in ways that sounded fair, but in the eyes of each side still preserved their dignity. She could sense the tension beneath the surface, like a wire pulled too tight. One wrong word, one mistranslation could make it snap. As the voices continued around her, Lena kept her posture still and her tone calm. She tried to focus entirely on the words. The translator fed her, yet once or twice she thought the sentences she heard had strange shapes, as if certain meanings were just slightly bent. The alien's eyes would narrow at times in ways that did not match the polite tone in their voices. She adjusted her phrasing, trying to soften whatever edge the translation might be giving, but her mind kept circling back to that flicker, that small blink of the light earlier when one delegate from the Eastern faction leaned forward to speak directly to her. She noticed something else in his tone, something that sounded heavier than the words she heard. He finished, and she replied carefully, but he drew back with a sudden stiffening of his shoulders. On the opposite side, the Western faction delegate gave a low growl-like sound, and the room's atmosphere grew sharper. The moderator quickly shifted to another speaker. But Lena's heartbeat had already quickened in her chest. She reminded herself of her training. Trust the translator, trust the process, and focus on the goal. Yet there was an unease curling at the edges of her mind like a shadow she could not quite see. The meeting had only just begun, and already she sensed the fine balance of peace swaying on a fragile line. One small error could tilt everything toward disaster, and though she could not yet prove it, she had the feeling that her greatest tool, the device she relied upon more than anything else, might not be as perfect as everyone believed. The chamber's air seemed to grow heavier as the discussions moved forward, each speaker taking their turn, yet their voices held an edge that was sharper than before. Lena listened carefully, letting the words flow into her ear through the translator. But the more she listened, the more she felt a strange pull in the meaning of certain sentences. Sometimes it was only a single word that felt too strong or too soft. Other times it was a whole phrase that made her think of an entirely different tone. She could not tell if it was her imagination or if the translator was bending the sense in ways she could not easily detect across the curved table. The Western faction delegate leaned forward again, his eyes fixed on her in an unblinking stare. His skin shimmered with a faint ripple of color that her human mind read as a sign of agitation. Though the translator whispered his words as formal and calm, she noticed how the opposite faction's representatives reacted. One of them shifted his claws along the table's surface, making a faint scratching sound. Another tilted their head back and let out a low exhalation that was too controlled to be simple breathing. It felt as if something dangerous was moving beneath the polite surface. Answered with care, shaping her response to avoid direct confrontation. Her voice was steady, but her heart was beginning to feel the weight of the moment. Her training told her that body language mattered as much as words in these meetings, and she could see the smallest details in the alien gestures, which might be invisible to anyone else. A turn of the hand, a blink that came too quickly, a slight shift in the crest of feathers on the Eastern delegate's head. These details spoke of mounting suspicion, even as the words claimed otherwise. The moderator moved the discussion to the next stage, which involved reviewing proposed terms of a temporary ceasefire. Lena had helped draft these terms to include elements that each side could see as a gain, while still being balanced enough to prevent claims of bias. She began to present the clauses, reading them in the calm, measured tone she had practiced many times. But midway through the third point, she saw the translator's light blink again. This time, it dimmed to near darkness for a full second before returning, and as she spoke the next sentence, she saw the entire Eastern side lean forward sharply, as if she had just thrown an insult across the table. Mind raced. She had not said anything that could be taken as hostile. She knew every word she had spoken, but the translator was the only link between her voice and their understanding. What if in that moment of flicker it had twisted her meaning into something far harsher than she intended? The Western side reacted too, their posture stiffening, weapons at their belts shifting in subtle readiness. The chamber's guard presence tensed as well, their eyes moving between the delegates like predators waiting for the first sign of violence. Lena forced herself to breathe slowly, to keep her hands relaxed on the table. She could not afford to show doubt or panic. Yet she needed to find a way to test whether the translator was betraying her without making it obvious. She decided to ask a question, one that was simple in her own language and would be harmless if it reached them correctly. She spoke of the ceremonial artifact at the center of the table, a symbol respected by both factions asking whether its placement during the talks was acceptable to them as tradition dictated. The translator whispered her own words back to her in the alien tongue. But as she listened closely, something in the rhythm of the sound felt wrong. Reaction was telling the Eastern faction leader tilted his head in surprise, while the Western faction representative gave a slow, narrow-eyed glance across the table. This was not the kind of reaction to a harmless question. Her suspicion grew. The translator was malfunctioning, or perhaps even tampered with. She recalled the sabotage cases she had studied in training, though they were rare and usually crude, meant to shut down a device. Entirely, this felt different, more subtle, as if someone wanted her words to be twisted just enough to cause mistrust. She thought of asking for a short break, but she knew such a request might itself be read as weakness or avoidance. In the tense balance of power, she decided to push on while trying to simplify her speech, choosing short, clear phrases in her own tongue and avoiding idioms or complex structures that could be more easily misinterpreted. The rest of the meeting segment passed with fewer open signs of anger, but the undercurrent remained strong. The delegates kept glancing at each other in ways that told her the seed of suspicion had already been planted. When the moderator called for a brief recess, the guards stepped forward to escort the delegates to their private chambers. Lena remained seated for a moment, watching them leave. The translator's light now glowed steadily again, as if nothing had happened. She reached up and touched it, feeling the faint warmth, but no irregularity. She wished she could remove it and check the signal logs, but the device was sealed to prevent tampering during active sessions. She knew she would have to get through the next stage of talks before any real technical inspection could be allowed. As she finally rose and walked toward the quiet side corridor that led to the human delegation's room, her mind ran through possibilities. Perhaps it was only a minor fault in the device's internal processing, caused by interference from the station systems, but the timing was too precise. The mistranslations had come exactly when the conversation touched on the most delicate points of the ceasefire proposal. This was not a random glitch. It felt like the careful hand of someone who understood exactly how to turn two ancient enemies against each other. Inside the small rest chamber, she allowed herself to lean against the wall, closing her eyes for a moment. The cool surface steadied her thoughts. She had to prepare for the next stage without fully trusting the translator, which meant she would need to rely on her memory of the alien languages, the tones and gestures she had studied long before she ever wore the device. Most diplomats in the Alliance dismissed such training as unnecessary now that technology made it possible to speak perfectly with any species. But Lena had always believed that understanding the heart of communication meant going beyond the machine. She straightened her back and opened her eyes. She knew the next round of talks could either move the factions closer to peace or shatter the fragile truce completely, and if the translator failed again at the wrong moment, it could be the last chance humanity had to prove its worth in the Alliance. The stakes were higher than they had been at any point in her career, and she would have to find a way to succeed, even if it meant setting aside the tool every diplomat depended on. When the signal for the next session came, the corridors of the station felt colder than before. Lena walked toward the chamber with measured steps, the golden light still streaming from the high crystal beams, but now it seemed to her less warm and more like the glow of a watchful eye. The guards at the door studied her as she entered, their stances unreadable, their armor catching the light. In sharp gleams, the two factions were already inside, seated, with an even greater distance between them than in the previous round, each group whispering among themselves in tones too low for the translator to catch until they addressed her directly. She sat down with her hands placed evenly on the polished table, her gaze moving between the leaders on both sides. The ceremonial artifact still rested in the center, its surface reflecting the light in soft shifting patterns. The moderator began with a formal welcome and an invitation to continue from where they had left off. The translator's hum returned to her ear, and the conversation resumed, but almost at once she sensed it, the same slight twisting of meaning that she could not hear in full yet could feel in the reactions of those around her. A phrase that should have sounded like a cautious agreement now caused the opposing side to stiffen their shoulders. A word meant to express caution seemed to land like an accusation. Heartbeat quickened. She knew she could not continue like this, letting the translator slowly poison every line of communication. The device was a chain binding her words to another one she could not control. She let her hand brush the side of her head as if adjusting the earpiece, and in that motion she pressed the power switch. The faint hum vanished. The voice in her ear fell silent, and in the sudden quiet, she heard the alien speech for what it was, unshaped by the machine, raw and layered with meaning. She had to strain to catch the tones and rhythms, but years of quiet practice came back to her. The Western leader spoke again. His voice a slow rolling sound with a low tone near the end of each phrase. She caught the gesture of his hands and the slight tilt of his head, which she remembered from her studies, as a sign of guarded openness. He was not rejecting her words, but asking for assurance. The eastern side responded, their voice sharper with higher rises at the end of sentences, a tone that often meant challenge, but here paired with the way their eyes moved from her to the artifact. She understood. It was a call for shared recognition, not an insult. Lena leaned forward, resting her fingertips lightly on the table. She used the few gestures she remembered, palms up to signal openness, then slowly lowering them to show stability. She spoke in her own language, but with a slow rhythm, shaping her tone to match the patterns she heard in theirs. The words themselves might not be understood, but the music of the voice and the openness of her movements could carry the intent. The Western side tilted their heads in what she believed was thoughtfulness. The Eastern side's crest feathers shifted in a way she had learned it meant cautious interest. It was a risk to continue without the translator. The council might later accuse her of violating protocol, but at this moment, the protocol itself was the threat to peace. She could not allow it to control the room any longer. She reached toward the ceremonial artifact, her fingers stopping just short of touching it, showing respect without intrusion, and then she slowly slid it forward so that it rested exactly between the two factions, equal distance from each. She kept her gaze steady, moving it from one side to the other, making sure both saw that she offered it as a shared symbol. The reaction was subtle but real. The tension in their postures eased just slightly. No weapons shifted, no claws tapped against the table. The air in the chamber felt less sharp. The moderator glanced at her with a faint narrowing of the eyes, perhaps unsure of what she was doing, but not yet stopping her. She could sense that the next few moments would decide whether her gamble worked. She continued speaking slowly, her hands making the gestures she had learned to mean mutual respect, mutual gain, and protection of future generations. She recalled from her training that both factions held deep cultural respect for the idea of inheritance, not just of material things, but of honor and memory. By focusing on that shared value, she could give them a point of connection beyond the disputes that had brought them here. The words flowed unevenly in her own tongue, but the intention was clear. She let the weight of sincerity carry them across the gap that technology had turned into a wall. Leaders exchanged glances. There was no sudden agreement, no declaration of peace, but there was no flare of anger either. And that was something. The sound of the guards shifting in the background faded, the edge of violence slipping further away. Lena felt her breath deepen in her chest, a sign that her own body was sensing the change as well. Yet she knew she could not let her guard down. Whoever had tampered with the translator might still be watching and waiting for another chance to break the fragile calm. She would have to be careful to keep the focus on shared values and visible respect without drifting into topics where misunderstanding could easily be stirred. She also knew she could not put the translator back on now that she had felt its betrayal. She would have to carry the rest of the meeting on her own voice and instincts. The discussion moved slowly, the pauses between exchanges long and heavy, but the tone remained steady. She could see the smallest signs of progress, the way the Eastern delegate's claws stayed flat against the table instead of tapping The way the Western leader's shoulders lowered a fraction as the minutes passed. She mirrored these signs back to them, her own posture open, but grounded, her tone soft, but certain, until even the moderator seemed to ease his grip on the arm of his chair. For the first time since entering the station, Lena felt a faint thread of hope winding through the tension. She had stepped away from the machine that every other diplomat trusted above their own skills, and in doing so, she had found a path that was slow and uncertain, but real. The factions were not friends, not yet, but they were no longer staring at each other with the eyes of battle, and that was enough to hold the door open for the next step. As the session closed, she stood and gave a small gesture of respect to each side, the kind that, in both cultures, was used when parting with a promise to return. She could feel the eyes of the guards and the moderator on her as she walked out, but she did not look back. She knew the real challenge would come soon. The sabotage had failed to create open conflict this time, but there would be another attempt, and when it came, she would be ready, not as a voice filtered through a perfect machine, but as a human who could speak to others without it. The corridors outside the chamber hummed softly with the sound of distant machinery, the station's heart beating in slow mechanical rhythm. Lena walked with the others back toward the waiting rooms, her steps quiet against the patterned floor, but inside her mind, there was no calm. She could feel the weight of every decision she had made since turning off the translator, and she knew the factions would return to the table soon with more questions than before. It was only a matter of time before the one who had planned the sabotage made a new move, and she had to be ready for it. She reached the human delegation's small chamber. She let the door slide shut behind her and leaned against it for a moment, listening to the faint thrum of the air filters. She replayed the last exchange in her head, the careful gestures, the measured tone, the way the factions had watched each other instead of reaching for their weapons. It had worked for now, but the balance was so fragile that the smallest spark could undo it all. She crossed the room to the narrow table where her notes were laid out, but she barely looked at them. Her mind was not on written words, now it was on the unspoken language of eyes and hands, and the subtle weight of silence. The call to return came sooner than she expected, the chime in the wall panel, ringing with a tone that felt sharper than before, as if urgency had been woven into the sound. She stepped out again, walking down the long corridor toward the chamber. The golden light seemed colder than before, and the guards at the door watched her with an intensity that made her wonder if they already knew something she did not. The tall doors opened, and the chamber beyond seemed even larger, emptier in its echo than when she had first walked in. The factions were already in place, their postures tense, their gazes fixed not on each other this time, but on her. She took her seat slowly, her eyes moving from one side to the other. The ceremonial artifact still rested in its place, but the air around it felt different, as if a silent challenge had been set in the space it occupied. The moderator's voice was calm as he announced that they would resume discussion of the ceasefire terms, but Lena felt the edge beneath his words. She noticed how the translator devices on each delegate's ear flickered, almost imperceptibly for a moment, before glowing steady again, and she understood the truth. Whoever had altered her translator had likely done the same to others. This was no attack aimed at her alone, it was meant to shatter the meeting entirely. Western leader began to speak, his words rolling low and heavy, and though Lena could not understand every detail, she caught enough to know he was demanding an explanation for an insult that had supposedly been given by the Eastern side. Moments before the session began, the Eastern leader's response came sharp and clipped, their crest feathers rising in a show of defensive pride. The two sides began speaking faster, overlapping one another. The moderator tried to restore order, but his own translator device flickered again, and the strain on his face showed that he too no longer trusted what he was hearing. In that instant, Lena knew the meeting was seconds from breaking into chaos. The guards near the walls shifted their stances, their hands near the weapons. They carried the artifact in the center of the table, gleamed in the light as if it too was aware of the danger. She rose from her seat, her palms open in the gesture of peace, and she spoke in her own language without the translator letting her voice carry across the chamber with a rhythm that matched the pattern she had learned. From both sides, she moved her hands in deliberate arcs, showing unity and shared purpose, drawing their attention away from each other and toward her. Words she chose were simple. They spoke of the long road that had brought them here, of the generations that had carried the weight of conflict, and of the fragile hope that could only survive if they protected it together. She spoke not to argue or explain, but to show with her voice and her presence that this was not a moment for suspicion. It was a moment to decide what kind of legacy they wished to leave behind. The Western leader's gaze shifted from the Eastern side to her, his eyes narrowing not in anger, but in thought. The Eastern leader's crest lowered slightly, a sign of guarded listening. Still, the tension had not fully eased. One of the younger delegates from the Western side rose suddenly, his hand near the hilt of the curved blade at his belt, his voice sharp as he shouted something that Lena could not fully understand. But the motion of his hand told her it was a challenge. Her own body moved before her mind could think. She stepped forward, placing herself between him and the table, her arms spread in a wide arc, a gesture from his culture that meant to block a strike without hostility. It was a motion used in ritual duels to signal the choice of words over violence. The chamber went still as he froze mid-step, his eyes locked on hers. Silence stretched for a long breath before he slowly lowered his hand. The Eastern side watched intently, perhaps realizing for the first time that she had learned more of their ways than any machine could translate. She lowered her arms but kept her stance firm, and then she did something no protocol manual would ever suggest. She reached for the ceremonial artifact, lifted it carefully, and walked to the exact center of the space between the factions, holding it high so the light touched every curve of its surface. Then she knelt, setting it gently on the floor between them, a gesture of equal surrender and equal claim. The meaning was unmistakable to both cultures. It was a sign that the one who placed the artifact there believed that unity was worth more than victory. It was a challenge to both sides to match that belief or admit before all that they valued pride above peace. The chamber remained silent, but in that silence something shifted. The Western leader leaned back slowly, his hands resting on the table. The Eastern leader gave a slow nod and lowered his gaze to the artifact. The moderator finally spoke, his voice quieter than before, asking if they could resume talks on the new terms. Lena stepped back from the center, returning to her seat, her heartbeat still hard in her chest. She knew the saboteurs' plan had failed here in this room, but she also knew they would not give up easily. This was only the turning point, not the end. Yet for the first time since arriving, she felt that the outcome might still be in their hands. When the session ended, the chamber doors closed with a slow, heavy sound, and the golden light above dimmed to its softer evening tone. Lena remained in her seat for a few breaths, watching as the delegates filed out, their movements slower than before, their eyes still on the artifact resting between them. It had not been moved by either side, and that in itself was a sign of progress. She let her shoulders ease, just slightly, feeling the tension drain from her arms, though her mind stayed alert. The moment for rest had not yet arrived. The moderator approached her quietly, his tall frame casting a shadow across the table, his voice low enough that it would not carry to the guards. He asked in careful words what had happened to her translator, and she answered with equal care that it had failed at a critical moment, and she had relied on her own training instead. His expression shifted as if he already suspected something deeper. He told her that during the last break, engineers had discovered signal interference within the translation network of the entire chamber. The source was still being traced, but it was not the result of any natural fault. This was enough to confirm what she had suspected from the first flicker. It was sabotage. She left the chamber with the moderator, and the two of them walked along the curved corridor toward the technical sector of the station. The air grew cooler here, and the walls changed to a darker metal, the lights sharper in tone. At the end of the hall, a small control room was filled With the hum of machines and the quiet clicking of alien keyboards, several engineers of different species worked at the consoles, their eyes fixed on streams of symbols that scrolled across the displays. One of them turned as Lena entered, explaining that the interference had been traced to a hidden device buried within the signal relays of the chamber itself. It had been designed not to shut down the translators entirely, but to alter specific phrases and tones enough to cause offense at key moments. The device was now in the hands of station security, who were running identification scans. Within minutes, the scans returned a match. It belonged to an operative from a third faction, not part of the talks at all, but with much to gain. If the two great powers destroyed each other, the operative had been posing as maintenance staff during the early preparations for the meeting, and had slipped the device into the relay unnoticed. Now they were in custody, being held under station law. The news spread quickly through the station's channels, and by the time Lena returned to the human delegation's quarters, the delegates from both factions had been informed. The talks resumed the next day. The atmosphere was changed. The two factions had not suddenly become allies, but the knowledge that their mistrust had been deliberately fueled by an outsider created a thin bond between them. The artifact still sat at the center of the table, and neither side moved it. Lena spoke carefully once again, without her translator, using her tone gestures and the simplest shared phrases she knew to guide the discussion. The moderator now supported her approach, even adjusting his own speech to match the slower, deliberate rhythm. She said the final hours were long but steady, each point of disagreement addressed without the sudden bursts of anger that had marked the earlier sessions. By the time the last clause of the agreement was read aloud, both sides gave the gesture of formal acceptance. It was not a permanent peace, but it was a ceasefire long enough for further talks to be planned. The chamber did not erupt in celebration. Instead, there was a quiet stillness, the kind that follows the passing of a storm when the air feels different because it has been changed. When the session ended, leaders of both factions made a rare gesture toward Lena. It was not a handshake nor a verbal thanks, but a small motion of the head and a turning of the hands, a sign in both cultures that acknowledged respect for an outsider who had acted with honor. She returned the gesture, keeping her voice silent, because the meaning was stronger without words. Later in the docking bay, as she prepared to leave the station, the moderator joined her once more. He told her that the council had been impressed not only by the way she had prevented the sabotage from succeeding, but by the fact that she had done so without relying on the very technology that the Alliance had considered unbreakable. They had already begun discussions about revising diplomatic training to include direct communication skills, gestures, tone, and cultural studies, just as she had used. It was a rare thing for the council to change tradition, but her success had made them see that no machine, no matter how advanced, could replace the human ability to adapt in the moment. Airlock doors opened, and the walkway extended toward her ship. She paused for a moment to look back through the transparent wall of the bay. The station hung in the black of space like a great lantern, its light shining out into the void somewhere. Behind those walls, the factions she had faced were beginning to see each other through a new lens, not of friendship, yet but of possibility. The artifact still stood between them, not as a trophy, but as a shared responsibility. She stepped onto the walkway, her boots making soft echoes in the enclosed space, her mind replaying the moments when everything had balanced. On the edge of collapse, she thought of the first flicker of the translator's light, of the decision to switch it off, of the way the alien leaders had watched her when she spoke with nothing between them but the air itself, and she knew that the strength that day had not come from perfect words, but from the willingness to step forward, even when the ground beneath her was uncertain. Inside the ship, the systems came to life, the hum of the engines rising as the crew prepared for departure. She settled into her seat, and for the first time since arriving, she allowed herself a deep, full breath outside the window. The stars waited, cold and endless, but to her they looked a little closer than before, as if the path between worlds had narrowed just slightly. As the ship pulled away from the station, Lena looked one last time at the golden light spilling from its edges, and thought of what she had learned that, even in a galaxy filled with countless languages and perfect machines, there would always be moments when only a human heart could carry the message across the silence, and in that thought she found the quiet certainty that whatever came next she would be ready to face at the end.